We're looking at the objections to Anselm's ontological argument here in part 2. And I want to clarify a couple things before we move on. You could skip ahead a minute if you don't want to hear the review and you've just watched part 1. But the argument itself could be presented in a variety of ways. The way I've done it is a common interpretation of the reasoning, but certainly a medievalist or one who is a scholar of Anselm might present it differently. Okay, very quickly, the argument went like this, right? God is something than which nothing greater can be thought, and that exists in the mind. And if something exists in the mind alone, it'd be greater if it also existed in reality. So suppose that God existed in the mind alone. Well, in that case, God could have been greater. How? By existing in reality. But that would mean that God's something than which a greater can be thought, and we had our contradiction at that point. And so we reject the supposition that God exists in the mind alone, and we have God existing in reality, at least something than which nothing greater can be thought existing in reality. So let's look at the objections. And one of the objections here that's written and often included when you have Anselm in an anthology, you typically only get that small portion of the proslogion, and then you have Gaunilo, a contemporary of Anselm, providing an objection. Now, Gaunilo was a monk. He's not objecting because he doesn't believe in God. He just doesn't think the argument works. So what Gaunilo does is he says, look, if you use the same reasoning as Anselm does, you could prove the existence of a perfect island, an island than which you can't conceive of a greater. But, you know, this island doesn't exist, right? Such an island doesn't in fact exist, this nearly perfect island, this island than which none greater can be thought. So there has to be some flaw in the reasoning, right? You could use the exact same reasoning, conclude that you have this almost perfect island or perfect island, but the island doesn't exist. Therefore, there's some flaw in concluding that God exists. Okay, now, first of all, in this kind of response, we have to be very clear exactly what's going on with Gaunilo's response. Is he attacking the argument's premises, for example, or its validity? Well, actually, this is a little bit trickier than it might first appear. It certainly appears that he's attempting to provide a counterexample using the same argument structure, thus showing that the argument structure is invalid. That's what it looks like, right? He's saying the argument structure is flawed. But what was the flaw, right? Gaunilo doesn't say. Gaunilo doesn't pinpoint the step of reasoning that is mistaken. Okay, but he does have this argument that does seem to need a response. I mean, if you could do this, why not, you know, have the water bottle then on which greater can be conceived, and so on and so forth. So Anselm takes the argument seriously, and he says, look, that kind of reasoning, the reasoning that I'm using, it only applies to the kind of thing that I'm proving. I'm talking about being unrestricted in type, right? Once you start talking about a certain type of being, like an island or a water bottle, well, then the argument doesn't work because one of the premises fails in that case. So you can conceive of such an island not existing. Okay, but you cannot conceive of God not existing. God is a being, right? No qualifications on a type here, than which none greater can be thought. But an island is a specific type of thing, and because it's a specific type of thing, you can imagine that thing not existing. You can't do that with the being than which none greater can be thought, because it would have to exist in order to meet the qualification of the description, as he argued previously. Okay, an expanded defense. Now, this may be taking Anselm's idea and just developing it more clearly. It may be, you might want to consider this a completely different kind of response to this objection. But I'm going to follow an example provided by Alvin Plantinga. And he says, the flaw is this. When Gaunilo starts talking about the island than which none greater can be thought, that's really not something that you can have in your mind. Why? Because the island cannot be conceived. That there's no perfection of an island. What would it be? How many palm trees would it have to be perfect? How many people would live on the island to be perfect? What temperature in the daytime would the island have? In the evening, what would it change? There are all kinds of things of which there doesn't seem to be a perfection involved. The issue here is there's no upper bound to the perfections of the island, right? It's just not, it's like saying the largest integer, right? You can use that phrase, but that phrase does not refer to anything. Okay, so Plantinga says that's the case with islands. So just to be clear here, some characteristics do have an intrinsic maximum. I'll give an example in just a moment, right? Well, we could use being dark or being cold. Let's use being cold. Okay, and God's characteristics are like that. So God's characteristics, what is maximal knowledge? Well, we can kind of clarify what we mean by that. What is maximal goodness? We can clarify what we mean by that. What is maximal power? These things can be clarified and talked about and discussed, and theologians do such things. But so, for example, let's take cold. All right. So there is a maximum cold. If you remove all the heat entirely from something or some location, then you have what we call absolute zero, which is 0 degrees Kelvin, or 273 degrees below 0 Celsius, right? So you can use the words, well, I want something colder than that. I want something 275 degrees below 0 Celsius. You can say something like that, but there's no reference to that phrase. It refers to nothing. And so you can say the island than which none greater can be thought, but there's no reference there. It doesn't make any sense, just like saying 275 degrees below 0 Celsius doesn't make any sense in actuality, right? The phrase kind of has a meaning, but it doesn't refer to anything. And Plantinga seems to say that's what the case is when you start talking about islands. However, when you just talk about being broadly conceived, then there is this definable upper bound. So for omniscience, for every true proposition, God believes that proposition. You might add, God believes no false proposition. And that there's a lot of work on omniscience, and you can clarify that in a variety of ways, but it certainly seems like there is a maximum there. And so that the phrase something unqualified, than which nothing greater can be thought, makes sense. And it does make sense that it has a reference. Okay, let's consider some other objections. One way, so that was objecting to the structure of the argument somehow by providing a counterexample. Another way to attack an argument, of course, is by attacking the premises. So some might object to the first premise where we said that God is something than which nothing greater can be thought. And they might say, well, that's not a good definition of God, right? Why isn't that a good definition? Well, the God of religions has a lot of other characteristics that are important, like being creator. And that definition doesn't include that necessarily, like being a loving father or a loving mother, right? The definition itself doesn't include those concepts, right? Now, what should we say about that? Well, you can grant the objection, but does it really undermine the argument, right? You can simply say, as I did in part one, that we're not providing a definition, we're providing a description. Anselm's conception may not be a great definition. Some people may like it as a definition, but so what if it's a definition or not? It's a perfectly acceptable identifying phrase. So consider someone talking about me, Gordon Pettit. So they might say, who is that? Well, he's the professor who teaches at Western Illinois University and teaches that class, Freedom and Responsibility. Now, that would be a perfectly acceptable identifying phrase. And I am the only person who has ever taught that class, likely to be the only person who ever will, unfortunately, given the history and direction of Western Illinois University. But it's a perfectly acceptable identifying phrase, even though that would be a terrible definition of who I am. That's not a definition of Gordon Pettit. But you could run an argument with that phrase and it would make sense because it would be referring to me. Okay, second objection might be directed at premise 2, the one that says God exists in the mind. So recall we had that chart. We said that some things could exist in the mind alone and not in reality. Some things could exist both in the mind and in reality, and some things could exist in reality but not in the mind. And it seems like the objection goes, there are difficulties associated with the claim that something exists in the mind. Now, what exactly is the difficulty? Well, it's not like, let's be a crass identity theorist when it comes to the mind, just say the mind is the brain. It's not like Godzilla exists in the brain, right? Your brain is too small to hold Godzilla, right? Well, of course, that's silly. We say things like the Black Panther is in that movie, right? And we say things like, I have in mind a number between 1 and 10, right? And we say things like, can you imagine a monster more vicious than Godzilla? And somebody could certainly say yes and give a description there. All right, so that doesn't seem to be that problematic to talk about something existing in the mind. We do this all the time. Okay, another way to attack the argument would be to object to premise 3. Now, premise 3 was if something exists in the mind alone, the thing would be greater if it existed both in the mind and in reality. Now, somebody might say, and I've heard students say something like this, what about a nuclear holocaust? Wouldn't that be better if it just stayed in the mind and not exist in reality? Right? And it seems like that would be the case. Now, there are some reasonable responses here. So the objection is the principle is not universally true. And if it's not universally true, it's not the kind of thing that we should include in an argument for the existence of God, right? But a couple responses. One is recall the context to the argument. Anselm, he's writing in the medieval times, and there is a background metaphysics there that is going to be broadly accepted by him and everyone else who's reading his work. And the claim's taken out of context of that metaphysics. And the metaphysics isn't crazy at all, at least in my view. So what we have in mind here is that the thing is greater ontologically speaking if it actually exists. So we might say things like the perfect storm. And although we don't want to be in the perfect storm, it would be a greater storm if it existed in reality, right? So it makes sense to talk about that something being greater to exist in reality, even if it's not something we want to exist in reality. So just on the ontological basis alone, it is greater existing in reality. Okay, or, you could just back out of this and not worry about the discussion we've been having and the way we've been having it. You could just substitute a different principle. A more specific principle certainly would be true. Something like this, it's greater for a good being to exist than not to exist. And that certainly seems to be true. And this objection, you could run the argument entirely with that premise, making appropriate adjustments, and it seems like premise 3 is not really going to be a problem. Okay, now this is a general objection that I've often heard from students. I wouldn't include it were it not for that being the case. A lot of students have said to me, well, I can conceive of something greater than God. And at first this confused me. The problem is the objection seems to include a contradiction. And here, right, I put a lot on the screen there, sorry, but the key phrase is something than which nothing greater can be thought. So you can't think of something greater than God, right? That's built into the definition. You can't say, I know how God have been better, could have been better. You know, somebody might say, well, God could have been better if he didn't create mosquitoes. You know, that would have made God better. You know, somebody might say something like that. Well, if you have in mind something that could have been better, then you don't have in mind the idea that Anselm's talking about, right? Your initial conception of God then is not Anselm's conception of God. So you're talking about something else. Anselm's talking about the being than which none greater can be thought, and whether or not that being exists. Now, Anselm obviously identifies that being as God, and it seems that it's perfectly reasonable to do so. So this objection doesn't really seem to get off the ground. Now, let me turn to one last objection, and this is reconsidering an objection to 2. Here is where I think it's a more substantive objection. A lot more people seem to get behind this one. So let's think it through. Is it really God who exists in my mind? We're just going back to the same objection. Or is it a conception of God, right? So the existence of God is not the same thing as the conception of God. Now, wait a minute. I do think this is rehashing previous territory that we've already covered. Go back to what we said about the objection to premise 2 earlier. I think it still is appropriate here and addresses this issue here. Certainly Anselm was aware of this distinction. Anselm himself talked about paintings and the idea of a painting existing in the mind versus one existing in reality. And you can think of, well, we just have the concept of the painting, but that's different from the painting. And so what exists in the mind is just the concept and not the painting itself. But wait a minute, we are talking about something than which nothing greater can be thought. That idea, Anselm might say, the idea itself would be greater if it referred to something that actually existed. It would be a greater idea. And this is the kind of reasoning that does have its roots in the history of philosophy. And so this might be an approach that Anselm might respond with. Whether that's satisfactory to you, I'll leave it for you to sort through.